churches have a connection with the afterlife and a hint of what may become of us when we shuffle off this mortal coil. But few places of worship make the link between religion and death quite so apparent as the Cemetery Church of All Saints in Sedlik, which is a suburb of Kutna Hora, right in the centre of the Czech Republic. The chapel, also known as the Kostnice Ossuary Beinhaus, is decorated with the bones of an estimated 40,000 human skeletons. The bones have been arranged in all sorts of forms and furnishings. The vaults are framed by great garlands of human skulls. There is a chandelier that is said to contain at least one example of every single bone in the human body. There are coats of arms, literally. How did this come about? It may look as if it's the legacy of some bloodthirsty medieval count, a memento left behind by Vlad the Impaler or his ilk. But the truth is a simple case of overcrowding. After a 13th century abbot returned from the Holy Land with soil from Golgotha, which he sprinkled over the cemetery, the site became the most desirable graveyard around. Many skeletons were exhumed to make room, and the resulting pile of bones was eventually put to ornamental use by the monks. Today, Sedlik has turned its most infamous place into a tourist destination. It even has a gift shop, so that those of a macabre bent can bone up on a little history themselves. (875) South Bundy Drive, Brentwood, Los Angeles. This was the home where, on the 12th of June 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson was found murdered, along with her friend Ronald Goldman. Goldman was on a visit to return Nicole's mother's sunglasses, which had been left in the restaurant where he worked. Nicole's ex-husband, football legend, sports commentator, and sometime movie star Orenthal James Simpson, known to the world as OJ, was arrested and tried for the two murders. But not before a slow-speed police chase of Simpson on Interstate 405, following his failure to turn himself in, and the release of a letter he wrote to the media denying involvement in the crimes, but suggesting he was considering suicide. 4 days after the chase, Simpson appeared in court for his arraignment and pleaded not guilty to the two murders. The following trial lasted for 9 months and attracted so much global publicity that it was dubbed the trial of the century. The court case made many of the people involved in it familiar figures. The judge, Lance Ito, found himself the subject of television comedy parodies. Prosecutor Marsha Clark and leading member of the defense team, Johnny Cochran, also found themselves in the spotlight. Although there was a great deal of DNA evidence against Simpson, in the end it seemed as if the prosecution's case rested on its ill-advised choice of having Simpson try on one of the blood-soaked gloves implicated in the murders. Perhaps it had shrunk due to the blood or following a freezing and thawing process. Perhaps it is true that Simpson had stopped taking arthritis medication, resulting in a swelling of his joints. Or maybe he simply wasn't guilty. Whatever the reason, the glove clearly did not fit, and the jury took only 3 hours of deliberation before acquitting him on both charges. Amidst talk of a racially charged issue, mishandling by the prosecution, and a stunned reaction from relatives of the murder victims, Simpson walked away a free man.
As to count one, is this your verdict?
Any reaction? No comments.
However, in February 1997, the case took an even more bizarre turn when a civil jury in Santa Monica found Simpson guilty of the wrongful death of Goldman, as well as battery against both Goldman and Nicole Simpson. And the file is still not closed. A body of evidence now suggests Simpson's son Jason from his first marriage was the real murderer. He was 24 at the time of the murders and had a history of rage-filled psychotic episodes. And controversy flared again when Simpson attempted to publish a book called If I Did It in 2006, another twist in the long and tawdry drama surrounding the murders at South Bundy Drive. In 1936, Germany's Reich Air Ministry paid the town of Wolgast 750,000 Reichsmarks for the exclusive use of a large area of land near the mouth of the Pina River on the Baltic coast. 2 years later, it had nearly completed a facility which included an army research centre and a Luftwaffe test site. The Heeresversuchsstelle Peenemünde abbreviated as HVP, became one of 5 military proving grounds and the site for the development of several World War II guided missiles. The most notorious was the world's first operational liquid fuel rocket, the V2, known to its designers as the A4. The V2 rocket was the progenitor of all modern rockets and a direct forerunner of the Saturn V moon rocket. It was the first ballistic missile and the first man-made object launched into space. It also took an extraordinary amount of testing to get right. When finally used against the Allies in World War II, V2 rockets were responsible for the deaths of around 7,000 people. But 20,000 had died during construction of them. Most of those were slave labour workers from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. As Roy Irons pointed out in his book, Hitler's Terror Weapons, however, by 1943 the Germans were doing so badly in the war that Hitler was determined to press on with testing the weapon in order to build German morale and show his troops the war was still winnable. But still the testing gave rise to embarrassments and mistakes. In April 1943, the commander of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, came to Peenemünde with the intention of taking control of the research and development program in order to expand his power base. But before he could indulge in the inevitable power play with the leaders of the program, Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun, a faulty test saw one of the rockets land on Himmler's own plane, and it was back to the drawing board for the rocket once again. From the original missile design to the day the V2s were finally put into production, 65,000 changes were made. In August 1943, the Allied forces bombed Peenemünde, causing disruption and the loss of several months of development. The main production of V2s was moved to the underground Mittelwerk factory near Nordhausen. War shortages also had an effect. Testing had begun in March 1942, but unexplained in-flight disintegrations resulted in an 80% failure rate. There was a veritable litany of errors, such as rockets exploding at liftoff, noses breaking off, and steam generators misbehaving. But still the Germans persevered, realizing that if they could get the V2 to work, its supersonic and therefore silent flight would make it a formidable weapon. One that, unlike its predecessor, the V1 flying bomb or the Doodlebug, would give no warning to unsuspecting targets. And on the 3rd of October, 1942, they finally got it right, with the V2's first successful flight. Just over 6,000 V2s were built, and as many as 3,225 were launched against Allied territory, beginning in September 1944, with attacks on the recently liberated Paris. Other targets included Belgium, England, and the Netherlands, with Antwerp and London being the hardest hit. Around 2,700 civilians were killed in London, with the last British civilian to die being 34-year-old Mrs. Ivy Millichamp at her home in Orpington. Despite this, overall the V2 lacked effectiveness. Its guidance systems weren't sophisticated enough. At $2 billion, the program was extremely expensive, and basically it all came too late. What the program did do, though, was to lay the foundations for the space race that would take off only a few short years later. At just after 7 o'clock on the evening of the 21st of December 1988, a bomb exploded on Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747-121 named Clippermaid of the Sea. The aeroplane had taken off from Heathrow Airport and was en route for JFK in New York. But the 450 grams of plastic explosive detonated in the forward cargo hold, completely destroying the plane. Victims and debris were scattered over a huge stretch of southwest Scotland, with both wings and some of the fuselage landing on Sherwood Crescent in the small town of Lockerbie. Everyone on board was killed, as well as 11 people on the ground. In 2001, Libyan intelligence officer Abdel Basset Ali Mohamed al-Magrahi, was jailed for life for the planting of the bomb, although he has always claimed his innocence. In a city full of recognisable landmarks, the Tower of London still stands out as one of the most historical and fascinating buildings in the English capital. Situated on the north bank of the River Thames, not far from Tower Bridge, its full title is Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London. The most familiar part of the building is the original White Tower, the square fortress constructed by William the Conqueror in 1078. Today, the tower is first and foremost a tourist destination, famous for its yeoman warders, or beefeaters. They have patrolled the grounds since 1485, when first installed as Henry VII's bodyguards. Now, while they officially protect the crown jewels, they mostly serve as guides to the thousands of tourists who visit the tower every year. In 2007, the first ever female beefeater, Moira Cameron, joined their ranks. But the tower wasn't always such a jolly place to be. On the contrary, it has a long and often macabre history. Its original use was as a fortress, palace, and prison, particularly for high-profile or religious captives. The tower was used as a residence by such monarchs as Richard the Lionheart, Henry III, and Edward I. It was Henry who made it a significant royal palace and constructed palatial buildings inside the Inner Bailey. It remained a royal dwelling until the time of Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s. Its most infamous use, however, was as a prison and place of torture and execution. The roll call of those beheaded in its grounds includes two wives of Henry VIII, Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. The latter's ghost is said to walk around the tower with her head tucked underneath her arm. Other famous captives included Sir Walter Raleigh, Guy Fawkes, and even Queen Elizabeth I, who was held for a couple of months in 1554 on suspicion of being involved in Wyatt's rebellion. The tower also housed an armoury and torture chambers, which boasted such charming implements as the Scavenger's Daughter, a sort of compression instrument, and the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, or more simply, the rack. And while they may not have been acquainted with either of these two horrific daughters, the princes in the tower almost certainly suffered within its walls. Placed there by their uncle Richard III, the two young sons of Edward IV were declared illegitimate by an Act of Parliament, and then simply never heard of again. Many presume them to have been murdered on Richard's orders, but it seems now the truth will never be known. Another famous murder victim was Henry VI of England. Imprisoned in the Tower, he was found dead in May 1471. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, has long been suspected of the dastardly deed. The Tower was also home to a menagerie, established in the 13th century and boasting a number of big cats such as leopards and lions. The menagerie lasted until 1835, when the last of the animals were transferred to London Zoo in Regent's Park. The only animals left are the famous ravens. The legend has it that the Tower, the monarchy and the entire kingdom would fall if they ever left. No wonder then that one of the beefeater's most serious duties today is to make sure that those birds are extremely well looked after. Does the name Bucks Row mean anything to you? How about the name of the person most commonly associated with it, Jack the Ripper? This is Whitechapel, the area in the East End of London where a number of women working as prostitutes were mutilated and murdered in the latter half of 1888. To this day, there remains much debate about not only who Jack the Ripper really was, but which of the women in the Whitechapel murders were actually his victims. Out of the 11 or so bodies, though, there is a group called the Canonical Five. Mary Ann Nichols, nicknamed Polly, was the first of these, killed on the 31st of August, 1888. Her body was discovered in the early hours of the morning on Bucks Row. Bucks Row, which has since been renamed Durward Street, was a back alley in Whitechapel, a couple of hundred metres away from the London Hospital. Some of the original buildings and brickwork still exist today, including the low brick wall stretching east from the board school, where Polly's body was found. For those of a strong disposition, you can still trace the Ripper's steps today, with various guided tours and excursions around the sites of the murders. Number 2 of the canonical 5 was Annie Chapman, who also had a nickname, Dark Annie. She was found on the 8th of September, dead in a backyard in Spitalfields, with her uterus removed. Throughout the police investigation, a huge number of letters were sent to the police. Most of them were declared hoaxes, but there were a handful that the police took more seriously. The first of these was the Dear Boss letter, received on the 29th of September. It was the first time the serial killer signed himself Jack the Ripper, and also referred to clipping a lady's ears off, which rang alarm bells the very next day. The 30th of September was the day that became known as the double event, because within the space of 24 hours, 2 mutilated bodies were discovered by police. Victim number 3 was Elizabeth Stride, also known as Long Liz. The Swedish-born 43-year-old was found in the early hours in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street. Like Bucks Row, Berner Street was also renamed to play down the ghoulish connotations. Catherine Eddowes was a bit different. Her body was found outside of Whitechapel, in Mitre Square in the City of London. This was the furthest west of all the murders, and the fact that she was found on the same day as Elizabeth Stride has made some ripperologists, as those who study the case are called, claim her murder as proof that there wasn't just one ripper, but at least 2 killers at large at the same time. It was Eddowes' corpse, however, that persuaded the police that the Dear Boss letter was probably genuine. As well as missing a uterus and a kidney, she was found with one ear severed. It was this kind of mutilation that led people to suspect that the killer may be a surgeon or a butcher. The next missive attributed to the killer was the Saucy Jack postcard, which was delivered on the 1st of October and referred to both ear removal and the so-called double event of the previous day. Those details were already known by journalists, however, and so the card could still have been a hoax. With such widespread publicity and reporting of the murders, citizens were understandably nervous. And one of them, George Lusk, led the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee to patrol the streets at night. It was to Lusk that the next letter was addressed. It is widely thought to be the most probably authentic epistle, largely because it arrived accompanied by a box containing half a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The writer made a gruesome claim about the other half. "I fried and ate it," the letter said. "It was very nice." The last of the canonical 5 was Mary Jane Kelly, nicknamed Ginger. She was the only one of them found indoors, discovered on the bed in her single room at Miller's Court in Spitalfields. Her corpse was the most mutilated so far, with her heart being completely removed and many other internal organs taken out of her body and left around the room. Even with contemporary technology, we are still no closer to solving the mystery, and the list of possible suspects seems only to grow as the years go by. Will we ever know the truth? Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, having led the revolution which overthrew the dictator Batista. Castro's close ties with the Soviet Union made the United States very nervous. Following covert attempts to topple Castro, an economic embargo, and the failure of the US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion by Cuban exiles in April 1961, this mistrust and unease led to a terrifying standoff later that year. It became known to the Russians as the Caribbean Crisis, to the Cubans as the October Crisis, and to the US and its allies as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Tensions rose when the United States deployed 15 Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey. A Jupiter's range of 1,500 miles meant that they were a direct threat to Moscow. The Russians reacted immediately, and US reconnaissance planes sent out on the 14th of October spotted missile launching sites being constructed in Cuba. The incriminating photographs were shown to the new president, John F. Kennedy, who had succeeded Eisenhower in January. The escalating crisis soon became a baptism of fire for the 44-year-old president. Kennedy called a meeting of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. all ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, were they found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Eschewing a surgical airstrike and resisting pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff for an all-out invasion, Kennedy decided that the best course of action was a naval blockade of Cuba, although for reasons of international law, the term quarantine was used instead of blockade. Over the next few days, the Russians, via diplomat Andrei Gromyko, continued to deny the presence of any missiles in Cuba. But the U-2 reconnaissance planes reported that 4 Cuban sites were not only built, but fully operational. The Soviet Union's President Nikita Khrushchev labeled the quarantine an act of aggression. And amidst no let-up in the work on the missile sites, the Cubans prepared themselves for a US invasion. By the 25th of October, the crisis was at a head, with the US at defense readiness condition, DEFCON 2, for the first time in history, and the Soviets showing no signs of backing down. By the 27th of October, Castro was ready to fight, and he drafted a letter to Khrushchev calling for a preemptive strike on the United States. He also issued a directive that all Cuban anti-aircraft weapons should fire on any US aircraft. Previously, that order was only for groups of 2 or more aircraft. Khrushchev, however, remained calm, and the next morning he broadcast a message on Radio Moscow offering a new solution to the crisis. Khrushchev promised to remove the Cuban missiles if the Americans agreed to remove the Jupiters from Turkey, despite Turkey's continued insistence that they wanted the missiles to stay. During the next ExComm meeting, President Kennedy pushed for an agreement to Khrushchev's proposal, but his advisors were against it as they thought it would undermine NATO and Turkey. Around midday on the 27th, a US Lockheed U-2 plane was shot down in Cuba, adding to the tension. But Kennedy, despite earlier promising to launch an attack if that happened, held tight. By the end of the day, the US had drafted a letter to the USSR suggesting that they remove the weapons system from Cuba in exchange for the US removing the naval quarantine and promising not to invade Cuba. No mention was made of Turkey, but there was an unofficial agreement that the weapons in Turkey would be voluntarily dismantled after the standoff was resolved. The Americans didn't really expect a positive response to their message, but after the intervention of the United Nations, at 9 a.m. on the 28th of October, Khrushchev aired another broadcast on Radio Moscow, agreeing to dismantle the Cuban missiles and return them to the Soviet Union. The crisis was over, although many believed that the result was a compromise. But considering how close the world got to all-out nuclear war, a few bruised egos were a very small price to pay, indeed.